of directives: binding operational directives and emergency directives. These are, I like to describe them as mini laws that are applicable and mandatory to all federal agencies. The directives are issued by the Secretary of Homeland Security to the head of an agency, and they are mandatory, they're binding. When CISA issues a directive, federal agencies must follow it. There are two types of directives. There are binding operational directives, which are more strategic in nature, and there are emergency directives where we, as the name suggests, we issue in case of an emergency when we are dealing with the latest cybersecurity attack, with the latest incident, with the latest threats or vulnerabilities, and something needs to be done quickly. Just as an example, 2 years ago, there was a big vulnerability in Microsoft Windows code base that covered not just workstation, but also server operating systems. And we instructed federal agencies to immediately patch all their Windows endpoints. Within 10 days, we collectively, and when I say we, I don't mean CISA, we, all of us, the federal enterprise, we managed to update more than 2.4 million endpoints in 10 days. Again, going back to that earlier comment about the size of the enterprise. And then we have the binding operational directive, which are strategic in nature. They usually take a long time to develop and give agencies a long time to change the strategy, change the way they do things, and form. Usually they need to establish programs and do things long term. So with that in mind, we have issued several binding operational directives in the past, which are, again, foundational directives. They're based on our knowledge of the enterprise. They're based on our work with federal agencies, how we understand the federal enterprise, how we understand what the deficiencies in federal enterprise are, and where agencies need to go. And again, these binding operational directives, they set requirements, foundational requirements that are absolutely necessary. If you want to go zero trust, if you want to do anything else in cybersecurity, you have to do these basic cyber hygiene tasks first. One thing I forgot to tell you is, please feel free to interrupt me at any point. I really like when we have a conversation, when it's not just me talking here. So if there are any questions in the chat, please feel free to interrupt me, raise your hand, use the microphone. I'll be more than happy to ask your questions, and I'll be more than happy to take this conversation any way you want, where you want to be, and questions you want to ask about what CISA is currently doing in the federal enterprise. So I'll start with the most recent binding operational directive that was just issued earlier this month. This is the latest one. It's been under development for probably 2 years. It took us forever to develop it because there were a lot of challenges and a lot of negotiations with agencies. But this binding operational directive 2301 is about operational visibility. We've heard about EDR. We've heard about latest efforts to deploy EDR, which gives us this tremendous visibility at the endpoint. But even if you want to go EDR, the precondition for deploying your EDR is knowing, well, where do you need to employ EDR? What are your endpoints? This is what we mean by this basic operational visibility. And it really comes down to asset discovery, understanding what is on your network. We've been talking about it for years, but really there was no federal mandate. There was no coded requirement that said, this is what you must do. These are the basic requirements, the minimum baseline for this network discovery. So what this directive, starting, again, issued earlier this month, we give agencies 6 months, but 6 months from now, or now 5 months from now, agencies need to start doing endpoint discovery, asset discovery on all their IPv4 and IPv6 networks every 7 days. So at the minimum, every 7 days, you have to run some type of network discovery. We intentionally did not prescribe how to do it or what tool to use. We wanted to be vendor agnostic. There are many different ways this can be accomplished. We just wanted to make sure that agencies perform network discovery in a timely manner, and at the minimum, every 7 days. Network discovery or asset discovery, understanding what is on your network, which device, and any device with an IP address is in the scope of this network discovery. Once you know what's on your network, you need to be able to scan those devices, those assets, those endpoints. There's a slight distinction there, why we call them assets. Sometimes this is not a physical device. This could also be your virtual machine. The next step is we need to know what vulnerabilities exist on those endpoints. Interestingly enough, when we started working on, for years, you're all familiar with CDM program and the tools that we equipped agencies with and some of the requirements from CDM program. But For years, we were not happy with the results we were getting from CDM. And when we started talking to agencies, we realized that there is really no standard across federal enterprise on how to scan for vulnerabilities or when to scan for vulnerabilities. Each agency did something different. There were agencies that were scanning weekly. There were agencies that are scanning once a year. There are agencies that are scanning with credentials, without credentials. There all kinds of, you can only imagine the different types of scanning. So when we started doing research, not only did we realize that there was no federal mandate or standard that requires agencies to do this and explains how, there were no industry standards for scanning, for vulnerability scanning. So again, with this directive, we now require agencies to initiate vulnerability scans on all their devices every 14 days. So it's a cycle. We understand that that in large enterprises, the scan may not complete in 14 days, but even if your previous scan is not completed, you have to initiate this new scan every 14 days on all the assets that are discovered, and we require agencies to feed that information into the federal CDM dashboard. Again, what's in scope? Anything with an IP address, whether it's a physical asset, whether it's a virtual machine, whether it's IoT, OT, IT, we don't care. If it has an IP address, IPv4 or IPv6, and if it's accessible over your IPv4 or IPv6 network, it is in the scope of this directive and must be scanned for vulnerabilities every 14 days. Because you need to be aware, number one, what is in your network, and you need to be aware of vulnerabilities on those assets. Interestingly enough, this directive does not talk about remediation or mitigation of those vulnerabilities. It only talks about discovery. This is the precondition for operational visibility. How and when and what to remediate, that's a different problem. And I'll talk about it in a minute, but this particular directive only talks about operational visibility, asset discovery, and scanning for vulnerabilities on those assets. Again, we hope to see some significant changes. We hope to improve not only, and again, when I say we, I don't mean CISA only. This obviously helps CISA a lot with operational visibility so that we can protect the entire enterprise, but it helps you as an agency. I can share with this group, this is again, our close partner and friend. Why is this important? 2 years ago, there was a big vulnerability in on-premises Exchange server. And when we found out about this vulnerability, and this was disclosed to us way before it was publicly known, we sat in the room and we said, we need to do something about it. This is Exchange servers. They said, no, we are fully migrated to Office 365. No more Exchange on our enterprise. So we went back. We were deliberating. Do we issue a directive? What do we do? Is 13 enough? Is that enough critical mass? So we go with a directive. I said, well, let's double that number just to be safe. Let's assume there are 26 Exchange servers on the entire enterprise. My colleague said, no, we will triple that number. We'll assume there are 39 servers, and we're going to issue this directive. We did. Within a week, we found more than 1,300 Exchange servers in federal enterprise. Today, that count is over 1,600. Agencies were not aware of it. CISA had no idea. Individual agencies had no aware of it. This goes back to this precondition for operational visibility. We need to do a better job discovering assets on our networks and doing better job scanning for vulnerabilities on a more regular basis and more in-depth scanning, which means either credential scanning or scanning that is based on some type of client. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I do want to make sure that there is time for you guys to ask me questions, so feel free to interrupt me. I hope you find this interesting. The next topic is even more interesting, at least for me. It's been very close to my heart. So I told you how this latest directive only requires you to discover assets and scan for vulnerabilities. It doesn't say anything about what to do with those vulnerabilities. This is another problem. Traditionally, well, first of all, as you know, whenever a vulnerability is discovered that is publicly disclosed, usually it's disclosed to a vendor, there are authorities there for vulnerabilities that assign a CVE number. That CVE is just tracking number. Basically, each vulnerability has a number that's assigned to it, and then we track that vulnerability so we know which product it exists on, what mitigations exist, what remediations, what updates exist for that vulnerability. Since 1999, since January 1999, we've been tracking 185,000 CVE numbers. So there are 185,000 known vulnerabilities, and these vulnerabilities also are tracked in the National Vulnerability Database, which is maintained by NIST. 185,000 vulnerabilities. Each vulnerability is also examined for different factors, and based on those factors, it is assigned a CVSS score, or a criticality score. And that score is a numerical value between 1 and 10. Vulnerabilities that have this value between 7 and 9 are considered to be high criticality, and vulnerabilities with the score of 10 are considered to be critical vulnerabilities. Traditionally, federal agencies have been chasing and remediating vulnerabilities with the score higher than 7, vulnerabilities that are categorized as critical and high. Interestingly enough, when we again started to do research, we found no federal requirement that said you must remediate critical or high vulnerabilities. There's no such thing. Yet every single agency is chasing exactly critical and high vulnerabilities. Every single IG is auditing you for your ability to remediate critical and high vulnerabilities. You have to track them. You have to create poems. It's a ton of work, and it's a cat and mouse game. Obviously, you're never 100% clean. You're always chasing those vulnerabilities. You're never able to remediate all of them. Again, out of 185,000 vulnerabilities we are tracking today, 56,000 of them are categorized as critical and high. What we found, first of all, that way less than 4% of all vulnerabilities with CVE number ever get exploited. This is important. Way less than 4%. Why I say it this way is because 4%, the number of 4% also includes vulnerabilities with proof of concept. And we are only looking for those that are known to be exploited in the wild. Way less than 3%. More importantly, a lot of vulnerabilities that are exploited and used by adversaries are not categorized as critical and high. They can be medium, they can be low. But adversaries are capable of chaining them up, exploiting multiple vulnerabilities at the same time, grouping them. And if you add up the scores of those low or medium vulnerabilities, their cumulative score will be 10, 15, 20. But you're not even chasing them because of this unwritten requirement. You as a federal agency and your IG is also tracking you on that. You are chasing vulnerabilities with high CVSS score. So with that in mind, we decided to issue another binding operational directive. This was last year, 2201, which now requires, which creates a federal mandate for federal civilian executive branch agencies to track and remediate vulnerabilities that are known to be exploited. CISA has created a catalog of known exploited vulnerabilities, or KEVs, as we call them affectionately. We add vulnerabilities daily. Just this morning, before I left my office, we added 6 new vulnerabilities to the catalog. Based on our research, based on the evidence we have that vulnerability is being exploited in the wild, and when a vulnerability is assigned a CVE ID, and when there exists a remediation or an update for a vulnerability, we add that vulnerability to the catalog. I believe as of today, with this latest edition, there are about 900 vulnerabilities. These numbers are from earlier this month, so they change daily, obviously. But why is this important is, I have only 5 minutes, so I'll go really quick, and I hope I get some questions for you. But this cuts that number of 185,000 of vulnerabilities that we are tracking across the globe, and 56,000 vulnerabilities that you're chasing right now as an agency, to only about 900 vulnerabilities that are really being exploited, that matter, that are important to be tracked, important to be remediated. And this is, again, important to know, and we were working hard with agencies as well as their IGs to understand that the only federal mandate today is you must remediate known exploited vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that are categorized as high or critical, you can prioritize. You can still prioritize them and chase them if you want to, but there is no federal mandate to do that. What you're required to do is to remediate these 800, 900 known exploited vulnerability. What's really interesting about that number is when agencies started reporting to us where those vulnerabilities are and what the vulnerabilities they see in their enterprise, Out of 900 vulnerabilities, I believe agencies are only reporting about 500 of them. So there are only 500 of those that exist in federal enterprise. More importantly, 20 vulnerabilities out of this catalog constitute more than, I think I have that number on the next slide. Yes. So 20 vulnerabilities, 20 CVEs in the entire enterprise constitute more than 57, close to 60% of all findings in the enterprise. So if you were to push 20 patches, and now I'm exaggerating a little, obviously, it's not just a matter of pushing 20 patches, but if you were to push 20 patches through your enterprise and patch 20 vulnerabilities, you would cut the number of findings or number of all known exploited vulnerabilities in your enterprise by 60%. And those are some interesting numbers. And again, one of the major concerns was, why is CISA doing this? CISA is adding yet another requirement. And our argument was, no. We're not adding a new requirement. We're actually cutting down the number of requirements. We are helping you prioritize and understand what matters and understand what you are required to chase and what to look for. The only directive that we still have in place, 1901, that still requires remediation of highs and criticals is the directive that looks at your internet exposed assets, which is 1902, the cyber hygiene scanning, which occurs every week. If we find any vulnerabilities, obviously KEVs, you must remediate KEVs immediately, known exploited vulnerabilities, but because of their exposure, because of the criticality and risk factors, we still want you to remediate those that are categorized as critical and high on your external assets. And another directive that I quickly wanted to mention, which goes hand in hand with everything else I talked about, vulnerabilities and asset discovery, is our Binding Operational Directive 2001, which requires agencies to maintain vulnerability disclosure policies, which allows you to close that blind spot that, in spite of all the scanning that you do internal, you will never be able to see everything. This opens up your enterprise, or at least your internet exposed assets, to public researchers and general public. So if they ever find something that is potentially a vulnerability on your enterprise, they can report it to you and you can act appropriately. So really quick overview about a lot of things that we do at CISA. This was just a very quick, narrow coverage of some of the binding operational directives that are very important, that are mandatory, that are coming your way, and I assume a lot of you are already working on it. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you have.
So we do have a couple questions from online. So the first one is approximately what percentage of agencies are compliant with binding operational directives according to the timelines defined in those directives?
That is a great question. And again, compliance is, we don't do this out of compliance. That is also important to understand. We don't really, the primary driver behind this is not compliance, it's not reporting, it is really improving the cybersecurity posture of the enterprise. We have 102 agencies in our portfolio, ranging from the biggest civilian agency, Department of Veteran Affairs, with more than 500,000 employees. And on the other hand, we have small agencies with 1 or 2 employees. Believe it or not, there are federal agencies with only 2 employees. When it comes to, if you really want to know numbers, every single agency out of those 120 to which the directives apply are compliant. They comply. Obviously, the number of remediated vulnerabilities is not always 100%, because new vulnerabilities are added, new hosts are discovered. So that number always fluctuates, but that number is also very high. It's in high 90s. The agencies are constantly, again, and improving their ability to scan, to discover. As you discover more, obviously you see more vulnerabilities. Your percentage, your percentage may go down, but that is not something that should discourage agencies for doing more scanning. Obviously, the more visibility you get, the more you know, the better you are.
Cool. And then we have one last question. This came from Diane. So she said, you mentioned 5 pillars of zero trust. How is this different from other classifications which show 3 pillars, 6 pillars, 7 pillars, etc.?
That's a great question. Thank you. Again, this is just another way to look at zero trust, to help organizations prioritize and better understand where to focus their efforts when it comes to applying zero trust concepts. As I already said, that there's really very little new in zero trust concept. We've been doing security for decades, and all the old principles still apply. This is just a new way of looking. Again, our landscape has changed significantly. I already said in the last 10, 15 years, we have moved from those traditional on-premises networks behind the firewalls, where everything, you have to be physically in the office to even log into your computer. Think about, you're now working, people are working from all over the world. interestingly enough, when I was talking about directives, we work with NASA. One of our directives was applied on the International Space Station, in space. So again, the landscape has changed a little, and these 5 pillars just help us better understand how to prioritize our efforts and what to focus on. I wouldn't say that it significantly changes anything we do in cybersecurity. So, well, thank you very much. No more questions from the audience. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's always good to be back at HUD, and great to see you guys. Thank you.
So thank you for that presentation. Our next presentation will be done by GuidePoint. So John Paul Bordeaux, the federal CTO, will be presenting on the first steps to applying zero trust as it pertains to internet accessible systems and third-party applications.
So, can you pull up the presentation? Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? There we go. Hi, like she said, I'm Jean Paul Bordeaux. I'm here with GuidePoint Security. I also want to say thank you for some of the partners that we have here that have supported us in this presentation. And we purposely picked some partners that fit into this topic. So you're going to see them kind of in there, but Keeper, Mandiant, Ping, and Savient, we appreciate you guys' support in getting here and doing this presentation. A little bit about GuidePoint. We are a cybersecurity specific firm. We don't do anything else. We try to stay in our swim lane of cybersecurity. We're about 11 years old. We do everything from the high level, high touch, managed security, where we're managing a firewall, managing a SOC, all the way down to, I just need to solve a problem. I have one particular gap that I have in my controls or in my cybersecurity stack, and I need to find that solution, and we help people do that. Then we do the in-between, where we can do implementations, we can do assessments. We actually do incident response. We do PCI audits. We do all kinds of audits. We do everything in the cybersecurity realm. And I like to say that cybersecurity is way too big to be good at all of it. But we as a company, we're about 700 employees, and we try to have people in every area. So this is our reference architecture. I don't know if you can see this in the video, but this is our reference architecture that we've built, and it's very broad. Cybersecurity is very broad. We're going to talk specifically today around internet accessible applications. Frank mentioned that in his second to last slide, and what I'm specifically pulling out is an OMB memo, which actually fits right into the binding directives. It just comes from OMB, still comes under whitehouse.gov, but it's 2209, which is the zero trust memo that came out. And what I'm pulling out is that in there, CISA had asked every agency to find a particular application that's currently only accessible to the internal network. So you have to be sitting on the network, or you have to be VPN, but you have to have access to the internal network to see the application. And they've asked everybody to find one that's physical moderate and make it internet accessible. So it's an interesting term, and he brought it up, so we're going to talk about what that might mean, because I think there's a specific reason that CISA picked that term. So this is asked to be done within a year, and I'm gonna posit why, but Frank could probably tell us why they actually did this, because I know that although it came from OMB, I'm sure CISA had a very big hand in that showing up there. I believe part of the reason CISA is asking is because I think they know that this is where the world is moving. Internet accessible is where we have to go. It's not a matter of when, of if we're going to do it, it's when. Now, obviously, there's high sides, there's disconnected networks, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're just talking about internal networks. So I believe the motivation is they want to take the remote users, the mobile users that are not on network, and connect them to those cloud-hosted applications, to those software as a service applications, and bring those applications off of an internal network and make them internet accessible. So that may or may not mean what people, there's a lot of discussion around what that means. So what I like to point out is what we're talking about goes back to Google very early on in the zero trust discussions came up with the term Beyond Corp. And their whole philosophy is never trust anything. Nothing is on a safe network, whether it's the resource we're going to or it's the person trying to get there, the user or the asset, because it doesn't have to be a user, it could be just an asset that is an entity trying to access it. No matter which one, we're going to assume that none of these are safe. And that's the philosophy that I think CIS is trying to move agencies toward. And obviously, one of the things that's in the directive is make this move, and then they want to see how you do it. And I think part of the reason they ask for internet accessible is I think they want to see how people are going to approach that. They want to assess the success, and they want to see how people can get there. So, what does this mean for agencies? It's actually only one change in really how you do it. So internally accessible means behind the firewall, sitting on the network. You might be on the VPN, might be able to see it. It's visible moderate, right? It's got to be secure, and it's for internal users only. The only difference is that word internet accessible. It does not mean that it is no longer for internal users. It's still for internal users. So that doesn't change. And we're still trying to get visible moderate. So like Frank just mentioned, they have a different directive around those internet accessible applications. They're trying to bring more applications to that. So the last question on the slide is, does that mean it's externally facing? I don't think it necessarily means that. And I think a lot of agencies have come to that conclusion. However, it could. It could mean that you move it to where it's visible, but you can't get to it. You can only see it, but you can't talk to it. And so the two possible flavors that you could see this being applied is maybe it's externally visible. Maybe you can see it, you can touch it, but you can't access it. It still requires security. It's actually harder to do security this way. The other option is maybe it's not externally visible. It's still on a secure network, a VPC or something that's got guards around it, but maybe we have private access. So now we're talking about the move towards zero trust network access. So I gave a talk, I'm actually going to bring next slide talks about this. I gave a talk last week around not externally visible and using zero trust network access. I think that's where most people are going to go, and I see that right now as we talk to agencies. But some are moving things into infrastructure service or software as a service, which is really difficult to make it not internet accessible. So I'm actually going to talk today about the harder version, which is it is actually externally visible, but it's secure, it's safe, it's protected. And how do we get there? So I'm actually going to, the inlet one from last week in Albuquerque was not recorded. So I'm actually going to do a recording of that one so that I can share it with both the people that were inlet and then you guys. And by the way, I'm talking fast because I only have 25 minutes. So a lot to cover. So Frank brought up the zero trust architecture, and he said something that I say every day. Zero trust is not new. It may be codified. It may be putting some prism of how we look at cybersecurity. But if you really go back and look at what cybersecurity practitioners have been doing, zero trust is not new. What he mentioned with the 5 pillars, I personally like to talk about the 8 elements, including the 5 pillars, because those foundational pieces in CIS's architecture, and this is theirs, in the CIS's architecture includes the visibility and analytics, the automation orchestration, and then that governance, which is really in my opinion, is just a baseline you have to have, right? It's not the solution, but you got to start somewhere. Governance and policy, if you don't have that, what are you building on? So I talk about the 8 elements instead of the 5 pillars, but obviously the 5 pillars are critical. All right, so externally accessible overview. Now I'm talking on this talk about actually something that is visible, that could be reached out to. It's not in a private network, not only accessible through zero trust network access or some sort of private access. So what does that mean? So if you're going to move something from an internal only, and now it is visible, but you can't do anything with it, it's out there and externally visible, we need to make sure that we have external attack surface management. We have to know what both the user and a potential attacker sees. So we need that. We need strong identity governance. So if it's internal, we need good identity governance, but when it is externally viewable, we really need good identity governance. We also need, if they're remote users and they're not in the network, now they need to be able to access their identity anywhere. So we need to move towards a cloud-hosted identity provider. Now that could mean it's sitting in an IaaS and it's a piece of software, or it could mean it's software as a service. But either way, it has to be visible to that remote user wherever they are. I have one here that's going to be new to most people, but I'm passionate about this, and that is login and password health management. And we're going to talk about what I mean by that, but I think this is really critical when you have something that's externally visible. And then finally, we need to talk about moving it. If we're going to make it externally visible, it should not be on the internal network anymore. It has to move either to the DMZ or what I call the new DMZ, infrastructure as a service. It could move to, you could switch over to software as a service, right? If you have an internal ticket management, you move to ServiceNow. That's the same thing. So what am I not covering, but I think needs to change? We need solid IaaS and DaaS. So if we're doing good software development, we're doing SaaS, we're doing the testing of the code, once it goes visible, it needs to be tested both dynamically and interactively. And so I would say that this is critical. I'm not going to talk about that today. It's not in this talk, but it is something that needs to change and needs to be brought into if it's not already there. If it's externally visible, I'm a big believer in proxying and not letting people touch an application directly. Let's put something in between, whether it's a load balancer, a WAF, a CDN, which kind of does some of the same things. We need to put something in front of it. I don't want that application directly accessible. And then cloud-hosted EDR EPP. So I think all of us know there's a movement, CISA, is pushing towards cloud-hosted EDR EPP because now we have remote users. We need to be able to support their endpoints from a security, no matter where they are. And we need to be able to touch those endpoints with the security of that endpoint, no matter where they are. So I'm not talking about that today, but I believe that's really needs to be there. What I'm not talking about changing here is the device governance still needs to stay the same. Whether it's internal or external, it needs to have the same security. We need to maintain that. Data governance, same. I think if you're internal or you're external, you still should have good data governance. The other thing that doesn't change internally or externally is we need to make sure that, I believe, some sort of machine learning based network detection and response, and we need some sort of good microsegmentation. So what pillars and elements are we talking about? I'm really pulling out identity, network, application or workload, and then the visibility and analytics and the governance. I'm not really hitting the other ones very strongly. They're kind of touched a little bit, but I'm focused on those 5 elements here. All right, so what we're going to cover, we talked about external attack surface management, locking down those ultimate paths, right? I want to make sure there's no vulnerabilities, no other ways in besides the way I want people to come in through their identity. No APIs open. Big issue. Strong identity governance, because we need to make sure that there's clean policy, no drift, no users that are moving around and they have a lot more access than they shouldn't have, or risk, right? Mixing different roles that causes additional risk. We need to make sure that none of that happens. And like I said, cloud-hosted identity, usually through some sort of SSO with an IDP that's providing that access, providing that identity, providing the authentication and the authorization, and then handing that to the application. Login and password health management, one of the things I really like about this, visibility into the health of those user passwords. And that's going to, you're probably not going to know what I'm meaning that until I get there, but this is a big one for me. It's a passionate one for me. And then the move to the DMZ, we talked about IaaS, or if you're hosting in the SaaS right away. All right, so attack surface management, and I'm specifically calling it external attack surface management because now we're externally visible. So we need to make sure that the application and any associated applications, even if the user doesn't actually see them, there's lots of pieces, parts of an application. Anything that is there cannot be accessed except for the path we want to give users. And so we're doing a surface look at what do users and what do attackers see. I don't want anything out there that I don't expect. So I'm going to do an attack surface management to see that, especially vulnerabilities, obviously. I'm a big one that APIs are a problem, and I think everybody knows that. We're all trying to figure that problem out, but I think APIs are one that specifically here I like to go after. And obviously the QA done properly. Now that we're moving it externally, it gets really important that testing is good. So I talked about the IaaS test. And like I said, highlighted, force all users through the authenticated path, no other path. So strong identity governance, clean up that identity drift. We've got to make sure if we're going to make it externally visible that anybody accessing that application, it's not something he had access to before, or maybe there's a mix of roles that causes risk that we don't want. So we're going to clean all that stuff up. Make sure that workflow, so as a user comes in and comes on board or goes off board, we'll make sure that is automated as much as possible with policy enforcement, that constant risk analysis. I believe the best is to find one that's SaaS hosted, because now we're talking about something that we're going into remote users and making things more external. So I think I recommend that to people, or IaaS with you hosting the software. And then continuous monitoring for those attribute changes, those user changes, those risk monitoring IGA solutions that are looking for changes that could cause more risk, and either highlight or remediate automatically. So cloud-hosted identity, that one's a pretty simple one. I think everybody gets that. If you're external and you're sitting at home, or you're in Starbucks, or you're at a hotel because you're traveling, or maybe you're on vacation and you have to access something, I need to have my identity accessible. It can't just be on the internal network. So we need that to be hosted. We need to have strong MFA. So obviously we're going to do FIDO compliant. 2209 said that. So either a PIV card or something that's FIDO compliant. Adaptive authentication. So we're really enforcing that zero trust. If something's odd or something's going on the identity, we want to challenge that user. If something changes in the session, maybe we push them back out and make them re-auth. So we're gonna have that integration there, that we're constantly doing adaptive authentication. And then I want to highlight that API authentication is included in this. So you want an identity that includes watching both user touching APIs, but mainly entities using APIs. The great thing about all the cloud that we do is that there is a lot of automation, and they mostly use APIs. We got to make sure that the authentication for that is controlled. And then SSO to pass that, those identities, those authenticated identities over to the ADC, WAF, or the CDN. And then federated for the possibility that maybe that cloud-hosted solution may not be accessible. So I'm a big fan of, I need a cloud-hosted and on-prem version. They need to be synced. And if for some reason, if I'm on-prem or on the network or somehow in there, I should be able to still operate. So we want to have that redundancy. My favorite. So login and password health. So one of the things that I think is a bugaboo for a lot of agencies and enterprises. So GuidePoint is has 8 commercial regions. So we all talk about this a lot. Is all of us in any enterprise, whether you're commercial or government, we interface with third-party different entities that we have to for work. If I'm an IT guy and I work on Cisco, I may have to go log into Cisco's portal and pull down firmware, or I may have to go. Maybe I'm assessing products and I'm looking at Gartner. All of those are third-party identities that are required for the agency user to do his job. How do we know that what authentication and identity and password he's using for his Cisco login or his Gartner login is within what we would want them to do? And we definitely don't want them to use the same government email and the same password, even when similar to something they use in the internal enterprise. So how do you manage that? How do you know that? What you do is you bring in and log in a password manager that is an enterprise password manager. So all of us have heard of LastPass and KeyPass and all the different password managers. We need one that the enterprise owns, and the users should use anything they use for their government work should be used inside of that password manager. And I'm highlighting Keeper because we believe they have one of the best enterprise management for visibility and health checks and making sure that things are healthy for the users. Because if I use, let's say I'm a HR person and I'm logging into Facebook and LinkedIn and all these things to check these people out before we come to hire them. And what happened in 2012? LinkedIn got popped. And we all got the notifications. Oh, but sorry, your login and password needs to change because the bad guys got it. If you used a similar password to your administrative internal user password and you used your HUD email, that could be a big problem in the enterprise. We need to watch that. Now that I'm having external application, if you use something similar for your LinkedIn, for your Cisco, for your whatever you're logging into, we've got to make sure that doesn't happen, because if they get popped, that could be a serious problem. We could see that the password jamming, we could see some of those bots coming in and trying different combinations. So that's what I'm highlighting here. And I know it's not one that people talk about. It's one I'm very passionate about. I personally, and everyone I talk to, if you don't have a password manager at home for what you do on your personal, get one. It is really important because you don't want any of your passwords to be the same, and it's very difficult to manage otherwise. So just PSA. All right, sorry, off my soapbox on that one. And then finally, but we need to host this, right? If I don't believe that the DMZ is the way we go anymore. I think it's really either IaaS or we get rid of the internal and find a SaaS that does exactly what we want. But in either case, it needs to be externally accessible. This is the best way to get there. And using AWS, Azure, or Google now, you can get that hosted application in a secure way. There's ways to get there. All right. So so microsegmentation I'm touching on here. So in 2209 and in the NIST Zero Trust, they specifically call out microsegmentation as different than network segmentation. So a little bit of a PSA again, soapbox again, they are different. And really when you talk about what they're trying to call out, they're calling out host-based segmentation, not network-based segmentation. And I think the main reason people don't do it right now is because it's hard. And it's really hard to figure out what those policies are. All of us who've been around for a long time have tried to do host-based firewalls and know that it's very difficult to find those policies that work and don't cause problems. I believe if you're only doing it for the applications and the resources, it gets easier, but also you need some sort of machine learning. And that's where the technology is today for microsegmentation. You need something that can use machine learning to learn the applications, learn what they do need to talk to, and create those policies. So off the soapbox on that one. So recap, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, all right. Okay, all right, I'm good on time. So recap, we talked about external attack surface management, strong identity governance. We're moving out, we gotta make sure it's really tight. We need to host that identity where it's accessible. We need that login and password health. You heard my soapbox on that. And then we're gonna move that application to either a SaaS, IaaS, or in the DMZ. So I've covered that. And again, thank you to Keeper, Mandiant, Peng, and Savient, who were our supporters, and I'm open to any questions.
So we do have some questions online if we don't have any in the room. So the first came from Jake. He wanted to hear your take on low code, no code. So specifically, he said, I'd be curious to hear a take on low/no code and how we can do two things. One, move to use those capabilities to streamline services and customer service for external stakeholders, while two, addressing cybersecurity risk while not letting the risk considerations override the need for using low/no code to provide those additional efficiencies and services.
Yeah, I think that's where we're going. Low code, no code is I think a significant part of the future. It's not the only thing. We're gonna have a mix of a lot, but I do agree with Jake that I think low code, no code helps security. It reduces the amount of problems we'll have in the code itself, and that does improve security. You're still going to end up with some of the same boundary issues, right? We still need to have a lot of what I talked about stays the same. But I agree with Jake that low code, no code has become part of the IaaS platforms that we have out there. There's a few different platforms, but there's a lot out there that you can leverage. And the thing I really like about low code, no code is we've all learned that lift and shift doesn't work. It causes a lot of problems. So if we're doing low code, no code, it allows that transition and adoption of cloud benefits to be easier. So getting the right people involved that can move something from a currently internal, maybe it's a 15-year-old application we're trying to move. If we can move it to low code, no code, I agree with Jake. I think that it's a good way to move things into the future. And I think we're going to have a lot of mixtures of low code, no code, classical development, a lot of different ways too. What's the next segment?
So the next question is from Vanessa. I'm going to do my best to read it out loud. So it says, so what do you need to achieve digital trust? Is one, trust identities, trust connectivity, trusted devices, and trusted services. So that's the first question. And then the second is, what are you thinking for a secure future?
So I'm going to go back to Vanessa hit exactly where we're at, right? So the idea behind zero trust is what she just said. We need to have trust in the pillars, and we need to understand that trust. So I say there's 8 elements because the 5 pillars are the 5 areas we have to have trust that Vanessa mentioned in order to have security. But how do we know that trust that's where the foundational, the other 3 elements come in. So the only way to know we have that trust is for us to have some sort of visibility that has analytics to understand what the current state of those different 5 pillars are. And then once we have that understanding, we have to use automation orchestration to make decisions. So exactly like Vanessa said, in order to get there, we have to have those 5 pillars. We have to understand the situation, and then we have to make decisions. And that, again, that all sits on that foundational piece of governance. And
I think you got it. She also added a clarification of if there's any specific considerations for systems that are out of date or legacy systems.
Yeah, and that is a very difficult problem, right? And that's probably not one like that is legacy, that is right now a challenge for an agency. That could either be a primary candidate if you're looking to fix that problem, or it could be one you don't want to tackle because it's that much of a problem, right? I could see agencies go both ways. Hey, I want to go full bore and I want to attack the elephant in the room is I have this 20-year-old application. The developers are gone. The contractor left 10 years ago. We don't know how to tackle it. We're just going to refactor the whole thing. Maybe we'll use low code, no code, right? That could be one areas, and it is a challenge. I think it depends on the agency and what resources they have and what they think they can do, whether they're going to tackle those more difficult legacy applications or come after the easier, maybe I still have people around that can help us refactor it and move it. So that is every agency right now is dealing with this challenge of legacy applications. One of the ways that people are addressing them now is really honestly wrappers, right? We're putting ADCs and WAFs and CDNs because that gives a layer of protection around it. It's not the end solution. It is definitely not the final state, but I do see people trying to put wrappers around some of them so they can bring them to the 21st century where they find a way to take a legacy application and redo it. But I actually am pretty happy in the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, I've seen several major agencies take on that, where they have a 20 or 30-year-old application they know is a problem, and they're working very hard to redo the entire application, a version 2 or version 6 or whatever they need to do to get that application to the future. And I think part of that is the move to the cloud, right? You have to redo an entire application. You can't just lift and shift it. And I think that it is a significant problem, and some are tackling it with this and some are not.
Cool. So that was our final question. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
So we're now going to have about a 15-minute break for folks to go outside and view the vendor exhibits. It might be more like a 20-minute break. We're planning to reconvene at 11:15 Eastern Standard Time. So thank you, everyone, for participating.
Hey, good morning, everyone. I'm Matt Tebow. I'm with AT&T Public Sector Cybersecurity. I want to say thank you for HUD for having me out today and putting on this educational segment for everybody. It's easy to get up here and talk about tools, technologies, implementation aspects, especially as it pertains to zero trust and some of the cybersecurity elements that you need to be productive within your environment these days. Today, though, I want to talk mainly about the mandates, directives, and some of the guidances that have come out from agencies such as the White House, OMB, CISA, and kind of what those strategies and policies really mean for federal agencies, even into the broader public sector market. I support a lot of SLED entities as well across public sector, and they often look to federal entities and these guidances as guideposts for what they should be doing within their environment as well. So, within the past 24 months, there has been a significant amount of events within the cybersecurity landscape, federal, even in the commercial space, such as SolarWinds, Log4j, Colonial Pipeline, that have had a marketable impact on what's, going on within the marketplace. So what better time for the White House to come out with an executive order that covers more of a strategy, policy, and guidance perspective on how do we evolve ourselves into a more mature and capable security, practice. So this presentation, I was originally going to talk about the EO, then some of the CISA binding operational directives. The gentleman from CISA covered those in great detail before, so I'll still cover those a little bit, just in case anybody in the room or in the audience wasn't able to hear that. But we're primarily going to focus on the executive order and some of the outtakes and mandates from that. So released on May 12th, 2021, this was a huge and sweeping broad order that really focused on making sure that we're meeting the needs of the time, doing the technology requirements, compliance requirements, process requirements, and also reporting requirements that the president has set forth with guidance from CISA, OMB, and some of the other agencies here. We all know the compliance frameworks such as FSMA, FedRAMP, CMMC, some of those new ones that are coming out. This isn't a compliance framework, right? This is more of a policy and strategy to create that cyber culture and practice to be more effective moving forward. So when we talk about technology requirements within there, we're going to go into these in some more details here. But think about multi-factor authentication, logging analytics. Haj talked about this before with the new SIM platform that's being stood up, encryption inspection, et cetera. Compliance requirements, right? There's a lot of you need to do this within the executive order that's going to be met. Process requirements, information sharing is at the core of this, right? We need to be able to take academic, private industry, and government, information, share those more collaboratively and be able to effectively share indicators of compromise. What's going on within a specific agency? Is that going on in another one as well? And then from a reporting place, how do we ensure that these mandates, follow-ons from OMB, follow-ons from CISA, and some of the guidances from this executive order are actually being put into place and actually being utilized? So, the executive order as a whole charges federal civilian executive agencies, as well as private industry and academia, to work with CISA, NIST, other agencies to collaborate together, be more effective in their cyber practices, and really drive into the next phase there. The last thing I'll say here too is this is not just impacting to the federal government. This is going to drive policies that a lot of entities such as SLED, even commercial entities, are going to use as best practices and guidances moving forward. So when we talk about some of the high-level excerpts here, I'm not going to say this is exhaustive, right? It's a huge document, but as a whole, these are some of the important ones that I wanted to talk about today. So the executive order is broken down into 10 sections, if you will. 8 of those are what I'd consider substantive, and these are some of the key experts from that, right? So, within 120 days, and this forms the real core of it, service providers and agencies need to be able to collect and share, analyze and put to use all the information, threat intelligence, indicators of compromise to help with the prevention, detection, and response of those actions and security incidents that they see. This is something as simple as reporting incidents to CISA or DHS, whatever agency you need to in a more timely manner, or having private industries say, hey, these are new patching and updates that need to happen more frequently. Let's get those out into the hands of the actual end users more rapidly. And this really forms the core of what is considered being more collaborative here. The next one I'll talk about is, with respect to zero trust, this zero trust idea is going to be paramount across the board everywhere, right, as we move forward. So creating a fundamental, NIST publication that shows zero trust architecture, zero trust guidance strategy was of paramount importance. And within 60 days, each agency head was expected to create a zero trust implementation plan to present that, to the director of OMB to be able to get the funding, to be able to get the information necessary to move along that path. The next one I'll talk about here too is, with respect to being able to understand what data you have in your environment, what data needs to be prioritized, what data needs to be classified as sensitive or non-sensitive, doing that kind of discovery, and we'll get into some of the asset discovery that was talked about earlier in later slides here. Being able to generate that report within a short period of time was a key part of this as well. And then talking about some of the technologies here. So within 180 days, doing multi-factor authentication and encryption, both in transit and at rest, where applicable, was of paramount importance, right? So when you have, whether or not soft tokens, hard tokens, biometrics, multi-factor authentication is a kind of a readily available tool and technology to be able to use that it needs to be implemented as much as possible. And within 180 days, if that was not implemented to the greatest extent possible, right, those are in air quotes, a justification needed to be provided for that. So one of the key aspects that I think is going to be really revolutionary in the cyberspace, both for government end users and service providers, is this idea of kind of an SBOM, right, in software security. So the 180 days director of NIST needed to issue preliminary guidance on enhancing software supply chain security. So this is where the whole SBOM, software bill of materials, came about. We need to be able to say, where was code developed, how was it developed, who developed it, and how is that code being maintained and updated, so you can avoid some of the situations that we've seen in the last 2 years, or at least mitigate that, right? So OMB did release Memoranda 2218 and last month, September 14th, and this really provided the core guidance on software security and referenced some of that NIST guidance there. Then we move into some of the, we have all this technology and tools and implementation to be able to capture this data, analyze it, figure out when security incidents are happening. What happens when we actually need to do vulnerability scans and some of the incident response on that? When you look across many security operations in the public sector space, incident response is not standardized. So that can make it very difficult to say, hey, where are you at in your incident response chain, right? Where are you at in your vulnerability management cycle, right? How does that look? So creating a standardized playbook, if you will, that helps standardize the actions and how you respond to these incidents will create that, create a more robust and standardized operation across the federal government there. Also, kind of an interesting note is that once this gets released, if agencies want to deviate from this, they have to consult with the director of OMB and the AP NSA to gain an exception on this. The second to last thing I want to talk about here, and we'll dive into this in more detail, is Memoranda 2201, is some of the EDR recommendations, right? So we heard about this earlier, EDR, Endpoint Detection and Response, or EPP, right? Some people call it that acronym. This is absolutely going to shift the paradigm from, hey, how do I build bigger walls? How do I ensure that nothing gets into my network to even hit those devices in the first place? To realizing things are going to get through that network, right? We're going to have devices that need to have built-in native detection and response capabilities themselves at the device level. And this will be able to feed into SIM or SOC capabilities as well, additional logs, additional telemetry, additional incident response capabilities through APIs or automated responses. So OMB released this Memoranda 2201 back in October of last year, and it pretty much said agencies, you have to start to do a gap analysis on not only what EDR capabilities you have in place today, but where do you need to deploy them in the future? It was referenced earlier that it doesn't make sense to put EDR on everything that can have it, right? It would be great, but it's not realistic. So how do we prioritize those endpoints or those devices that need that, and make sure that those critical assets, or that may be classified as high value assets, HVAs, get log feeds into the SIM and have those capabilities with them. And then we have the big one, right? Memoranda 2131. So this is enterprise logging maturity levels. I have a slide on this after this. And this one has a kind of a 3-layer approach to it in terms of requirements when you need to reach enterprise logging level 1, 2, and 3. We'll dive into that in a second here. But this is one that I see a lot of agencies and a lot of even other public non-federal agencies asking questions about. How do we meet these requirements? How do we get all the logs into the SOC? How do we make sure that we're inspecting encrypted traffic? All those aspects that go into this. I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but there are multiple OMB mandates that have been released following the executive order that are directly tied to it. I have those listed here in case anyone wants to reference that afterwards. All right. So M2131, right? So this is all about logging maturity. How do I ensure that I have telemetry, log information, and I'm throwing that all into the right SIM product, bashing that, correlating that against indicators of compromise, and making use of the environment, right? So when I think about security, You have the active defense capabilities, think stuff that'll actually do block and tackle, your firewalls, your DLPs, etc. When you need to actually verify and do threat hunting, you need to verify that these devices are doing what they say they should. When you want to be looking for insider threats, when you want to do retroactive reviews, when you find out, hey, Log4j has been in place for months, or SolarWinds has been in place for months. Am I affected? What systems got affected? This is how you can do that, right? So it all starts based upon, how do I know what assets can generate logs in my environment, and how do I get those assets to send logs to my SOC environment as well? So there's 3 primary enterprise logging maturity levels that are important here. EL1, which is considered basic and you're expected to get there within 12 months. Enterprise level 2, which is intermediate, you have till 18 months, and this includes also the inspection of encrypted traffic. And then enterprise level 3, which is advanced, excuse me, and that's within 2 years of the issuance here. And this memorandum was issued back in August of 21. So the next maturity level that is being expected of agencies to meet is coming up in March of next year, and that's EL2. We've been working with various customers on this, and one of the key challenges here is there are network, compute, and storage implications of reaching these maturity levels. So if you've only been collecting logs off of, a handful of assets or a subset of your network for, the last couple of years, you may not realize how much more log data, how much more, compute resources you need to be able to make use of those logs, to be able to store those logs or retain those logs for the correct timeframes. And that has a cost and process and operational implication to it. So I think being able to plan in advance for this is very key. And that's why these timeframes are a little bit longer than you might see in other mandates here, especially when you consider, hey, I have to scale here. This goes back to a lot of the zero trust paradigms that we talked about in the data pillar, for example, and the visibility and analytics that were in the bottom of those zero trust pillars. If you don't have the logs, you can't analyze them. You can't understand what's going on in your environment. You can't do the threat hunting. And that provides you kind of the data pillar that allows you to validate and do additional hunting to make sure that you're operating in a full zero trust model. The last thing too is that part of this is that being able to provide those logs to CISA and the FBI as needed as well. So if an event happens within an agency or within a particular entity, being able to provide those logs to the FBI or CISA in this case, for them to be able to do additional threat hunting, to be able to help you with those. And this goes back to the initial information sharing idea is of real importance here. So when I talk about these mandates and directives, I know this was already covered briefly in the CISA directives section that we covered earlier. I'll cover it real quickly again, just for anybody who wasn't here for that section. But they issued these binding operational directives that do very similar things that the OMB mandates do, right? So these, of course, only cover specific federal agencies within the civilian executive branch. They don't cover the DoD or national security systems. And the 2 that I'm going to focus on today are the 2201 and the 2301s here. So 2201, really went back and echoing what the gentleman from CISA said, is all about the idea of a KVE versus CVE, right? Known exploited vulnerability that has actually been exploited in the wild. As he mentioned and showed with that really great data, 185,000 CVEs down to 835 KEVs. It moves that from here's an unreasonable amount of CVEs to go and address and fix to, hey, here's a very strategic and smaller number of KVEs that can actually be tackled. I'm not going to spend too much time on that one because it was covered in great detail. But the 2301, I think, really goes back to some of this M2131 that I talked about previously. Asset discovery, right? You cannot secure your networks, and you cannot be mature in a vulnerability management program if you don't know what is on your network and you don't have a mature vulnerability management program. So being able to perform these automated asset discoveries, whether it's automated tools in most situations every 7 days, inclusive of the entire IPv4 space and the IPv6 as well, making sure that those identified vulnerabilities are done using not only non-privileged credentials, but privileged credentials as well, this is going to create a much more mature vulnerability management program as you go through the process there. And the other thing I'd mention too is that you're supposed to be providing, status updates to CISA every 6 months. And again, these guidances are, fluctuating on a usual basis. So wrapping up here, right, the executive order provided a much needed catalyst, right? It came at a time where we knew that cybersecurity is continuing to be a much broader and important issue. These subsequent OMB mandates and the CISA binding operational directives are really going to provide a great guidepost for agencies and even non-federal entities to be able to use as best practices. And having to comply with these mandates, as the gentleman from CISA mentioned, right, these are mandatory. And I think it really provides a good step to making sure that it's more standardized across the federal space, and that our capabilities as a nation are consistently improving. So with that, I will end it there and let any questions go.
Oh, so Matt, we do have one question
Mhm.
for you. So this is from Celeste. How do standards issued by NIST work with the directives issued by CISA?
How do the standards issued by NIST?
Yeah, so like the
Operate.
NIST 800 series work with those directives from CISA, like the binding operational directives
Yeah.
and all those things you've been saying.
Yeah. So when you think of NIST provides the compliance and the frameworks, right? So think about zero trust, and I believe it's 800-207 if I'm not mistaken. That is aligned with the CISA zero trust security model, right? So as let's take the executive order, for example, right? When they say, hey, with M2209, the agencies need to be able to, migrate towards a zero trust model, incorporate some of these principles. And this creates more of a compliance framework and a guidepost to say, hey, here are some of the zero trust models, some of the zero trust architectures aligned with the CISA models, and then some of the CISA binding operational directives provide more of a you shall do this, right? And of course, NIST can do 853, which provides a lot of the you shall have these controls and capabilities as well. So they're all interlinked, but I think NIST really provides the foundational structure for what those architectures and what those strategies will look like.
Cool, perfect. I think that was the last question. So if there's no questions for the room, we appreciate your time today. Oh, we do.
So regarding asset discovery, whether it be endpoints or assets, do you keep track of those devices that an agency no longer uses?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the crazy examples that I've heard in recent with a customer is that they had an educational institution or an educational component or a research component of their environment spin up a ton of cloud VMs for high compute resources, and it was really bogging down the network, using a ton of resources, and it wasn't part of the known registry or inventory. And the IT team was going, "What the heck is this?" And then it went away, and it was a temporary thing, right? But it turns out that those cloud assets were still linked and still had connection into the internal network, right? And this was a public sector customer. So to answer your question, absolutely. I think it depends on what is the nature of the configuration. Did those assets have access to high value, databases? Can users still access it? It depends on if that asset has been, say, quarantined. Has it been decommissioned? Is it physically unplugged? What's the current state of it? If it's just turned off and not being used or hit, then absolutely it needs to be part of that registry, because it is still an attack vector that can be leveraged by adversaries. Now, if it's properly decommissioned, if it's properly taken offline and is no longer viably an attack vector, then I think it's something that then you would update that registry and say, hey, this is off my environment. But it all depends on kind of the connectivity, the use case, and can users or adversaries potentially still leverage that as an entry point. All right.
We did have one additional question come in just now from Vanessa. It says, are you referring to the cyber moonshot vision, a secure internet for critical societal functions?
I can't say I'm familiar with the moonshot. So no, I think is the
Okay.
answer.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Great. Thank you. Apparently I can't do stairs. Thank you, Matt, for that presentation. We're going to do one last quick break to see the vendor exhibits outside, and we'll reconvene at noon, in which we'll have our final presentation from Google at noon. Thank you, everyone.